Good evening, everybody. It's good to see you tonight. Thanks for being here as we join together to talk about the Old Testament. These Wednesday night classes, we're dealing with a series of lessons called an Old Testament survey, and it is exactly that. It is a rapid-fire trek through the Old Testament, and our prime objective is to be reminded of the Bible episodes in the chronological, historical order in which they occurred. So that, I don't know, we don't have John the Baptist rescuing Moses while he was floating in the ark in the Nile River, or something like that. Yeah. A lot of people, I think probably the general knowledge of the Bible in our culture is just horribly bad. Someone was telling me recently that some man on the street, kind of an interview, and they were offering $1,000 for any correct answer. And they were asking a series of really, really simple Bible questions, and nobody got a single answer right. General Bible knowledge is in our world is just terrible. We don't want to be that, right? We want to be good Bible students. We want to have a good working knowledge of the Bible. And part of that, I think, is what we're trying to accomplish in these simple lessons. These are not complicated lessons at all, but we're just trying to talk about things in chronological order so that we have that Bible timeline pictured in our minds very accurately. So in these studies, we start with the creation. God created all things in 6 literal consecutive 24-hour days. Adam and Eve, first man and woman, the sin, the fall, Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, afterwards the Tower of Babel and the dispersing of the people by confounding their languages. Then the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. We remember the promises to Abraham about a land, about a great nation, and about a seed, which would be Jesus, that would come centuries later. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Jacob's favorite son, Joseph. His brothers envied him. They sold him as a slave to Egypt. He rose in power in Egypt. The whole family moved down there. Everything was fine until after Joseph died. They were there for 400 years. By the end of that, they had actually become slaves in Egypt themselves. God sent Moses to tell Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Ultimately, after 10 plagues, Pharaoh relented, temporarily at least, and let the people go. They crossed the Red Sea. They went to Mount Sinai. God met with Moses on Mount Sinai, delivered the law of Moses on Mount Sinai. They were in the Sinai wilderness, but because of their unbelief and lack of faith, God made them wander there for 40 years. Ultimately, they were able to enter into the promised land, cross the Jordan River, and went into the promised land under the leadership of Joshua. Well, remember, the first city conquered in the promised land was Jericho. They eventually took possession of that land. One failing was, though, that they didn't completely, utterly drive out the people that had occupied it, the idolatrous people who had occupied the land. And those people became, as God said it would, those people became a snare to the Israelites. The Israelites engaged in repeated episodes of idolatrous worship. When they fell away from God and worshiped idols, God let them be oppressed. They'd cry out under such oppression. God would send a deliverer. A whole series of those deliverers we call the judges of Israel. Famous ones that sort of stand out in our mind: Gideon, the woman judge Deborah, Samson, the judge with long hair, the last of the judges being Samuel. Samuel, because the people requested it, Samuel appointed or anointed the first king over Israel, Saul. Saul was good at first, became bad. God did not prolong his dynasty. Instead, David came to the throne. We know that story. We know all about David and Goliath, and we know the sad story of David and Bathsheba. After David's son Solomon was on the throne. Only those were the only 3 kings over the United Kingdom. Saul, David, Solomon. Solomon's son Rehoboam could have had that job, but if he'd had any good sense about him, but he didn't. And when the people said, we need you to lighten the load, we need you to lower the tax bill, basically, and he wouldn't do it. His young friends who advised, he rejected the counsel of the old men who said, yeah, you should lighten the load. His young friends said, no, make it harder. And so he followed the advice of his young friends, and the nation rebelled. And it split the kingdom. And then we talked about the time of the divided kingdom. The 10 northern tribes came to carry the name Israel, and Judah and Benjamin in the south came to be known as Judah. And so the divided countries were Israel to the north, Judah to the south. The northern kingdom, first king over the northern kingdom was Jeroboam, and he was bad, and he led the people to worship idols, and every king after him was bad. The northern kingdom, just continual progression of bad kings. Finally, God allowed them to be taken away by the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire was the great empire of that time. They took them away, and as we mentioned, they transplanted in some people. They carried the people away captive and transplanted other people in, and those people that the Assyrians transplanted in were known as the Samaritans. Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, they came to be known as Samaritans. That's the ones we read about in the New Testament. The descendants of those people who were transplanted by the Assyrians were the Samaritans that we read about in the New Testament. Okay. The southern kingdom prevailed for over a century longer, but ultimately, because of their corruption, God allowed them to be taken away. But by this time, the Assyrian Empire had fallen, and the great empire of the world at that time was the Babylonian Empire under the great king Nebuchadnezzar. And so the southern kingdom of Judah also was taken away in captivity later by the Babylonians. Difference being, the northern kingdom never returned as a functioning whole. The southern kingdom did, and we're going to read a little bit about that in our study tonight. So last week, we talked about the divided kingdom, Israel to the north, Judah to the south. This lesson, if you're looking at your study guide, we're on lesson 8. You can follow along with us in the scripture. We're going to talk about what happened during and after the time that the southern kingdom was taken away into Babylonian captivity. There were actually 3 separate takings of people. The first in about 606 BC. Remember, dates BC get smaller as we come closer to the time of Christ. So the first people were taken at about 606 BC. Finally, the third group of people was taken in 586 BC. And that's when the temple was destroyed. Jerusalem was completely leveled at that time, and the captives taken away. Why do you think, so we said the northern kingdom never returned as a functioning whole, but the southern kingdom did. Why do you think the difference was? Why did God treat one kingdom differently than the other? Any thoughts? Tom?
Northern kingdom just turned away from God and was over.
Okay.
All things, set up idols, took people away from going to Jerusalem, all of what God had instructed them to do.
So they were totally corrupt. All the kings were bad. I think that's exactly right. They were a very bad lot of people. The southern kingdom had some good kings. There were some good kings in the southern kingdom. Who would stand out to you as a good king in the southern kingdom? Anybody? Hezekiah? Can you name another one? Josiah. So there were some good kings. And so Tom suggests the northern kingdom, if you're going to measure degrees of corruptness, I suppose you'd say the northern kingdom was several degrees of corruption worse than the southern kingdom. I'm thinking of something else. Sarah? Exactly right. The promise of the Messiah, that he would be of the tribe of Judah, a descendant of David. God's got to preserve that lineage. And so I would think that's a big, big factor in why Judah was preserved, so that the promised Messiah could come in that lineage. All right. The famous king of the Babylonians that took the southern kingdom of Judah into captivity was Nebuchadnezzar. Let's read in 2 Kings 24. In 2 Kings 24, beginning at verse 8, Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. And his mother's name was Nehushta, the daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father had done. At that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. And Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against the city, and his servants did besiege it. And Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon, he and his mother and his servants and his princes and his officers. And the king of Babylon took him in the 8th year of his reign, and he carried out thence all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon king of Israel had made in the temple of the Lord, as the Lord had said. And he carried away all Jerusalem, and all the princes, and all the mighty men of valor, even 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained, save the poorest of the sort of people of the land. And he carried away Jehoiachin to Babylon, and the king's mother, and the king's wives, and his officers, and the mighty men, all the mighty of the land. Those carried he into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. All the men of might, even 7,000, and craftsmen and smiths 1,000, all that were strong and apt for war, even them the king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon. So there's the final, ultimate captivity. As we said, there had been some captives taken early on. We're going to talk about Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in a minute. Some of the elites had been taken prior to this, but here at 586 was when there was this final taking and the destruction of the city. Our author asked us to mention about Ezekiel and Daniel. So two of the famous prophets of the Old Testament were men who lived in this time period and who prophesied in this time period of the Babylonian captivity. Look in Ezekiel 33. Both of them, Ezekiel and Daniel, had been taken earlier than this last taking of captives. In Ezekiel 33, verse 21, Ezekiel said, "It came to pass in the 12th year of our captivity, in the 10th month, in the 5th day of the month, that one that had escaped out of Jerusalem came unto me, saying, the city is smitten." So Ezekiel was one who was taken in an earlier taking, and he learned that the city had finally been ultimately taken and destroyed by someone who had escaped from there and came with that report. Daniel, of course, the book of Daniel is so interesting. We've studied it before. But you remember, here's some reference to the fact that Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, or sometimes they're referred to as the Chaldeans, they would select certain individuals and bring them with the intention of educating them, training them, incorporating them into the culture of Babylon. So these were not considered to be, harsh slaves, captives. Notice in Daniel chapter 1, verse 3, the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel. Now this is in that first taking, about 606. That he would bring certain of the eunuchs of Israel and the king's seed and the princes. So bring certain of the children of Israel and the king's seed and the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning in knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand at the king's palace, whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And a king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. And so Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were among those that were taken to receive this special treatment and special education to be appointed ultimately to serve the king. Now, you remember in verse 8 that Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. What would be the problem there? Somebody explain that to us. What's the problem? What's Daniel not wanting to do? Anybody? Wade?
Well, he's afraid that they'll give him something to eat that'll defile him.
So in what way would it defile him?
Could be pork or something that God had commanded the Israelites not to eat.
Something because we know there were dietary restrictions in the law of Moses, and so Wade is exactly right. Daniel was concerned not to eat what the king was providing because it would have not been according to the law, and so he asked to not do that. Verse 10, the prince of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall you make me endanger my head to the king. So the man in charge of these ones who are to receive this special treatment said, I don't know about that, So if you don't eat this rich food that is being specially prepared for you, you're going to look weak, you're going to look skinny, and the king's going to wonder why I'm not doing my job better. And so I could endanger my own life if I don't insist that you eat what's being provided. Daniel suggests a test. Verse 12, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. What's pulse? What's another version say? Vegetables. We don't want that potentially unclean meat you're offering. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, as thou seest, deal with thy servant. So he consented to them in this matter and proved them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat of the portion of the king's meat. Do you think that, I'm just asking you to speculate here, would that be typical? These other guys are going to eat all this fat food, all this wonderful provision. And Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are going to eat a vegetarian diet. Would it be typical that they would be fairer and fatter in flesh than the ones who did eat that? What do you think? I'm guessing not. So this has to be God's intervention. When you think this is God's providential intervention to make them fare well on the vegetarian diet that they are eating. So 17. Chapter 1, Daniel chapter 1, verse 17. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king communed with them. And among them was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. So God certainly blessed those 4 men. By the way, there in verse 19, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, that's their Hebrew names. Daniel was given a Babylonian name, Belteshazzar, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But we never very much read about Daniel being called by that Babylonian name. But the other 3, we know them by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I don't know why that's so. I don't know why that distinction is there. So a couple things happened, a couple of famous things happened. All of this, now remember, keep this in chronological view. All of this is taking place during the time of the Babylonian captivity. Judah is in Babylonian captivity. So remember chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream and Daniel interprets the dream. Really significant prophetic dream. Remember that it was a dream of an image made of different kinds of metals, and Daniel said it represented 4 successive empires. Nebuchadnezzar was the head, the Babylonian Empire. After him, the Persian Empire. After them, the Greek Empire. And after them, the Roman Empire. And there's where that famous prophecy is in chapter 2, verse 45, or verse 44. Verse 4, in the days of these, the last kings, the Roman kings, in the days of these shall the King of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. God's eternal kingdom, the church, would come in the days of the Roman kings. It did, right? So there's a very famous prophecy there in 2:44 of Daniel. In chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar constructs an image. Now, it doesn't say so exactly, but a lot of people speculate that Nebuchadnezzar constructed an image, the likeness of that he had seen in his vision that Daniel interpreted. I think that's probably not a crazy speculation. I don't think you could prove that. But whatever, Nebuchadnezzar sets up an image. And the requirement was, in chapter 3, verse 4, and Herod cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And whoso falleth not down and worship it shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. I'm not having any trouble understanding that ordinance. Seems pretty clear, right? Hear the music, you worship the image. You better do it, or you're going to get thrown in the fiery furnace. Well, of course, you know who didn't do it was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And at verse 12, it was reported to the king, verse 12, there are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said to them, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods nor worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you be ready, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made, well. But if ye worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. I tell you, that's powerful, isn't it? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, we're not going to do it. We believe God can deliver us. But first of all, we're not careful to answer. We're not timid. We're not hesitant to tell you our stand on this. Here's how it is, king. We're not going to worship that image. We believe our king can deliver us, and even if he doesn't, we're not bowing down to your image. And of course, you know what happened. They got thrown in the burning fire furnace, and of course, God did deliver them. The end of that episode, the king makes a decree, verse 29. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their households shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. So because they took that stand, then it caused an edict to be issued across the whole Babylonian Empire because those three men were so brave. Question that you can't answer. Here's a question that you can't answer. Where was Daniel? Daniel bowing down to that image? How come Daniel wasn't thrown in the fiery furnace too? There's no answer to that question. You know, there have been lots of speculation, none of it provable. You know, a lot of people think Daniel was away from Babylon on state business because they were serving the king, and he was a statesman. I think that could absolutely possibly be so. I tell you what I think I can say absolutely without fear of contradiction is Daniel didn't bow down to that image. We know that because of what's going to happen in chapter 6. Daniel shows that he has that same kind of courage that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego displayed. We don't know. The answer to that question is not available to us. Where was Daniel? What was going on with Daniel during that episode? We don't know. But Daniel shows his great strength in chapter 6. So Daniel keeps getting moved up in the government, and there are people who are jealous of him. And so verse 5, this is chapter 6, verse 5, they said, "We shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his Lord." So these guys are not dumb. And they realize the only way you're going to catch Daniel is if you try to put him in a bind between serving the king faithfully and serving his God faithfully. That's the only way you're going to try. It's the only way you can trap that guy. He's just too good. So they get the king to sign an order that no one could pray to anyone other than the king for 30 days. King make an edict that no one in the entire empire can pray to anyone but you for 30 days. That kind of played on the ego of the king. And so, and by the way, at this point, we've moved on past Nebuchadnezzar at this point. But the king makes that order without realizing what he'd been duped into doing. And Daniel, look at verse 10. "Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being opened in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime." He didn't change his practice. He knew that they would find him out, but he didn't change his practice. They found him out. They threw him in the lion's den. The lions didn't eat him. I always sort of tease the kids in the Bible drill class. So Daniel survives overnight in the lion's den. The king spends a sleepless night. Early the next day, he goes and calls out for Daniel. Daniel's alive and well in the lion's den. He pulls Daniel out, and he takes all of his accusers and their families and throws them in the lion's den. I always tease the kids. The reason the lions didn't eat Daniel is because they weren't even hungry. The lions just, they were well fed. They didn't have any desire for anything. That is provably not the case. When you look at verse 24, "The king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, their wives. And the lions had the mastery of them, and break all their bones in pieces, or ever they came at the bottom of the den." Before they hit the bottom, they were torn to pieces by the hungry lions. So again, great deliverance. And again, look at verse 26. The king says, "I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and steadfast forever in his kingdom. That which shall not be destroyed, in his dominion shall be even unto the end." So again, because one man takes a stand, notice this decree, empire-wide decree being made. Okay, so we got the Babylonians, and the Babylonians are the ones that conquer the southern kingdom of Judah, take them into captivity. It had been prophesied that this was going to be a 70-year captivity. And at the end of that 70 years, a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar calls Nebuchadnezzar his father, but that's kind of common terminology. He was his forefather. He was actually his grandfather. Belshazzar is having a drunken orgy, and specifically called for the vessels out of the temple in Jerusalem, and they're using them to drink their drunken potions. And in the course of that drunken orgy, a hand appears and writes on the wall. Handwriting on the wall. We still use that expression, right? And if you look in chapter 8, let's see, am I right? Oh no, chapter 5, excuse me, I'm sorry, chapter 5. If you look at chapter 5, and verse 25, so this was the writing. This is the writing that was written. Many tekel upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Many, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So Daniel interpreted the writing on the wall. And notice verse 30, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Mede took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. You know, that apparently, so during the time that Judah is in captivity, Babylon had been growing weaker, and the Medo-Persian Empire had been growing, and they were already attacking the Babylonians. In fact, at this point, apparently had the city of Babylon besieged. But the king thought that they were safe within the walls of Babylon. I have read historical readings that almost sound impossible to even comprehend. One thing I read said that the walls of Babylon were 300 feet tall and 75 feet thick. The ancient historian Herodotus said that. It's a little hard to imagine, but anyway, they had significant fortifications around Babylon. But what there was the river came under the wall and through the city and nourished the city, but the wall was built over that river. And apparently what the Medo-Persians did was they diverted the flow of the river so that the riverbed went dry, and they passed under the wall and came in and defeated the city. That's how history portrays that, how it could fall so suddenly. And so the Medes, or the Medo-Persians, or the Persian, that's the third empire, right? Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon. First of all, Assyria, taken by Babylon. Then the Babylon was the head of that image, to be followed by the Medo-Persians. This Darius that we read about in chapter 6 was a Medo-Persian king. But it was the Persians who authorized the people of Judah to go back to Judah and rebuild the city of Jerusalem. Look in 2 Chronicles 36. 2 Chronicles 36, verse 22. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia, that he might make a proclamation throughout his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus the king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth hath God, the Lord God of heaven, given to me. And he hath charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people, that the Lord his God might be with him, and let him go up? So here it says that Jeremiah had made a prophecy, and Cyrus was going to be the one to fulfill that prophecy. Jeremiah had made such a prophecy in chapter 25, verse 12 of Jeremiah. We read that prophecy. But actually Isaiah was even more specific. He's not mentioned there, but he was more specific. Look at Isaiah 44. Isaiah 44, verse 28. He saith of Cyrus, He is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, Thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundations shall be laid. So not only had Jeremiah predicted the end of the captivity, but Isaiah had as well. Isaiah actually, well before Jeremiah, Isaiah prophesied that more than 100 years before it came to pass. Isaiah prophesied and said the name of the king that it would be Cyrus who would authorize the Jews to go back and rebuild the temple. Really impressive prophecy. You know, how would Isaiah know that? How would he know that they'd be authorized to go back? And how in the world would he know the name of the king who would make that declaration? Obviously only by inspiration. So we're going to have to go quickly. We're going to run out of time again. There were 3 groups of people who went back. The first group that went back was led by a man named Zerubbabel. And the emphasis of Zerubbabel's work was to try and get the temple rebuilt. They faced a lot of opposition, and they kind of quit on the job. And 2 Old Testament prophets, who well known, Haggai and Zechariah, prophesied to the people saying, get busy and finish this work. And so Zechariah went back to accomplish the rebuilding of the temple, and they ultimately did, although it took them quite a while to do it. A second group of people was led back by Ezra, and the emphasis of Ezra's work was to build them up, build the people up spiritually. Look at Ezra chapter 7. In Ezra chapter 7, verse 10, it says, Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord and to do it and to teach in Israel statutes and judgments. We don't have time to read it, but Nehemiah mentions the work of Ezra as well. So Zerubbabel, rebuild the temple. Ezra, get the people spiritually built up. And then the third group is the one that we probably remember the most, was Nehemiah. Nehemiah led a third group of people back from captivity, and that's when they rebuilt the walls of the city of Jerusalem within 52 days. An incredible accomplishment. So we usually try to remember those 3 leaders, 3 different groups that returned from the captivity: Zerubbabel, Ezra, and then Nehemiah. Wade?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I don't know if you noticed it or not, but the Babylonians and both the Medo-Persians both spoke the same language, Aramaic. And one of the things I found out today, I didn't realize this, but Daniel is often criticized because they don't believe that Daniel had made those prophecies because it was so far in advance before he made those prophecies. And so they try to move Daniel like 300 years forward. But the Aramaic language changed from that time, and maybe it's 500 years. The Aramaic language changed. And so what Daniel prophesied in was the old Aramaic language, not the new Aramaic language.
Daniel has been criticized through the centuries because, as you said, his prophecies, we didn't talk about it. Daniel prophesied about a lot of things that would happen in what we call the intertestamental period, a period of about 400 years between the end of the Old Testament and before the New Testament started. There's about 400 years. And Daniel prophesied about a lot of historical developments that took place in that time period. And critics said, there's no way he could have done that. He's too accurate. He's too specific. This must have been written after it happened and credited to Daniel. You know, some fake business going on. But that's been disproven over and over again in the way that Wade suggested and other ways too. Daniel was an amazing prophet of God. Boy, I wish we had more time. We're just out of time. During this time period, one of the Persian kings was Ahasuerus. His queen, Vashti, displeased him. Apparently, he was engaged in a drunken event with a lot of his nobles and princes. And he called for the queen to come and show herself to these nobles and dignitaries. A lot of people speculate, again, probably fair speculation, but I don't know if you could prove it, but a lot of people say that he wanted her to display herself immodestly before this drunken mob. She wouldn't do it. So she was dethroned as queen, and Ahasuerus went about to select a new queen. And so he had all the fairest of the land brought before him. Among them was Esther, who was a Jew in exile, right? but she didn't let her ethnic identity be known, and she was chosen. She was chosen to be the new queen. Well, she had actually been raised by, let me get this straight, I think Mordecai was her cousin. She had been raised by not her parents, but by a man named Mordecai. And Mordecai made an enemy of a very powerful fellow named Haman. Mordecai, so this Haman, horribly wicked Haman, came to power. The king really liked him and brought him along, and he had lots of influence and power. And so when he came in and out of the king's court, everybody would bow down to him. But Mordecai, who had raised Esther, would not bow down to him, and it enraged him. And he was so angry that he wasn't getting the respect from Mordecai that he wanted. So he devised a scheme to have the Jews, not just Mordecai, but all the Jews. He devised a scheme to have the Jews completely annihilated throughout the empire, and was willing to pay a big price in order to see that that was accomplished. So when Mordecai knows of this, he goes, well, it's a whole, boy, what an interesting story. If you haven't read the whole book of Esther recently, sit down. It's easy to read in one sitting. Read the book of Esther. When Mordecai finds out that this scheme has been devised, it says in chapter 4, verse 11, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whatsoever, whether man or woman, shall come into the king. So Mordecai finds out what's going on, and he says to Esther, who's now the queen, you've got to go to the king and speak to him in our behalf. So, Mordecai is pressuring Esther, use your position of influence to secure the safety of the Jews. Esther is hesitant to do so because she says there in chapter 4, verse 11, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come into the king, into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai Esther's word. So Mordecai says to Esther, you got to go speak for us. You got to get the king aware of what's going on. I can't go. Because there's a rule, if you go before the king having not been summoned or invited to come before the king, off with your head. You'll be killed on the spot unless the king holds out his scepter to you. And he hasn't called for me in 30 days. I haven't seen the king in 30 days. I have not been called into his presence. I can't go. So you remember the famous reply of Mordecai. Verse 13, Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? That last expression is the very famous one. And we've talked very often about the whole story of Esther being a great study in God's providence. God, there's no indication of any miraculous deliverance here in this. Instead, it's just how God worked to save his people, providentially ensuring their safety. So, again, there was this rule that once the king had made an edict, it couldn't be suspended. The king couldn't cancel a kingly order that he had already put out there. So the order was made that the Jews, anybody the kingdom-wide, could kill the Jews and confiscate their goods. And that order was going to stand, but the king made a countermanding offer in chapter 8, verse 11. In chapter 8, verse 11, the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. And so the only way that they could be saved is that they had given authority to defend themselves, and they did. And that became then an observance of the Jews. Look at the last chapter of Esther, chapter 9, verse 29. Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, wrote with all authority to confirm this second letter of Purim. And he sent the letters unto all the Jews to 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim, for their times appointed according to as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had enjoined them. And they decreed for themselves and for their seed the matters of the fasting and their cry. And the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. So they began to observe an annual feast in memory of the deliverance of the Jews on this occasion. I wish we had time to talk about it. It's kind of interesting. They started a new holiday, a feast day for the Jews, the Feast of Purim. We could ask, whether that's appropriate or not. I think it must be. The inspired word doesn't say anything negative about it, but that became the annual observance of Purim, the deliverance of the Jews by Esther. Oh, wow, we're out of time. Passes fast. We covered so much history in each setting. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you.